Ladies and gentlemen, I'd just like to very briefly welcome you this evening before handing over to Ambassador O'Sullivan. This evening is really so important to us. The issue of the death penalty goes right to the heart of who we are as Europeans. And before we kick off this evening, I'd just like to flag a few other items that may be of interest this week that we've built around the World and Europe Day Against the Death Penalty. You'll hopefully have seen a joint declaration from the EU and from the Council of Europe earlier today. Ambassador O'Sullivan published an article on our Medium channel earlier today, and we also have a podcast published with death row exoneree Harold Wilson and with Elizabeth Zittrain from the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty. I'd also invite you to make good use of our hashtag AbolishDP, which we're using to draw together all of this conversation. We're very pleased this evening to have Ambassador O'Sullivan and Chargé d'Affaires Bold from the Embassy of Mongolia to give us opening remarks. Then we'll have a town hall discussion moderated by Robert Dunham, Executive Director of the Death Penalty Information Centre. And then closing remarks, assuming he gets here from his votes this evening, by Congressman Hank Johnson from Georgia. So we are privileged to have these guests and to have you all here with us. Thank you very much. Ambassador.
Well, thank you very much, James, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I, too, am very delighted to be able to welcome you to the European Union delegation in Washington on the occasion of World and Europe Day Against the Death Penalty. And we're delighted to have such distinguished guests and so many old friends I recognize now from 3 years of these events. It's great to have you all back. And we're very pleased that we've been able to gather a great number of advocates for the abolition of this cruel punishment. And whether you've joined us in person or online, tonight's discussion looks, we hope, to provide a thought-provoking level of engagement and discussion. I'd also like to particularly acknowledge the presence of Mr. Bat-Ochir, the Chargé d'Affaires of the Mongolian Embassy, who's joining us because they have taken an initiative at the United Nations, with which we're fully in support of, about trade for torture and the use of the death penalty. Ladies and gentlemen, as of today, 18 men have been executed in the United States this year, having spent a total of 337 years in prison. Unfortunately, there are 10 U.S. citizens scheduled for execution this month alone, 1 in Florida, 3 in Texas, 1 in Nevada, 3 in Ohio, and 2 in Alabama. So on a day like this, I think it's important to remember that had their crimes taken place in a different state, or even in a different county, or with a different prosecutor, their conviction might not have resulted in a death sentence. And the arbitrary nature of the way the death sentence is applied today should be a major concern to political leaders. Some of these men stand the chance still to have their life spared, and we hope that this can be the case. Every time this happens, it really depends on successful interventions by lawyers, civil rights groups, or other advocacy efforts to make a case. Sometimes historic changes define their fate, for example, when a state decides to abolish the death penalty, as Delaware did in 2016, or as when New Jersey did in 2007, and we truly hope that more will follow. Once every year, as James has said, the European Union speaks out loudly and clearly against the death penalty and highlights our efforts to abolish what we as a union of 28 nations consider an inhumane practice. 150 countries in the world have already abolished the death penalty or have introduced a moratorium. But it is with much regret that we have to observe that there's still, unfortunately, a lot of work to be done. The European Union is actively engaged across the globe to support the international abolition movement. Without the many advocates in the room this evening, our efforts would have far less impact. And I want to take the opportunity to thank you all for your work, in particular, of course, what you do here in the United States. Across the United States, 31 states continue to uphold capital punishment. As a country, the United States has been the only nation in the Americas that still carries out executions for the last 8 years. And it is the democracy with the largest number of executions each year. We believe that it is high time for political leaders across the country to show the necessary leadership to make abolition of the death penalty a reality. The European Union holds a robust and principled position against the death penalty. We are deeply convinced that capital punishment does not bring adequate compensation for the victims of even the most heinous crimes. It fails fundamentally to deter those from committing crimes that risk the penalty of execution. It is frequently marred by social injustice, and it makes wrongful convictions irreversible, of which there are just so many examples that can happen in any legal system. Since 1973, 159 people in 27 states have been released from death row with evidence of their innocence. We believe that the United States is at an important crossroads. Executions are, notwithstanding what I said earlier, at a historic low, and public opinion has never been more opposed to the death penalty. We believe if our advocacy efforts continue, we believe that the coming years can make the difference, that there is a window of opportunity. And the view from that window is bright. Prosecutors are increasingly reluctant to apply the death penalty. Executions have been postponed or sentences overturned. Various states have moved to halt executions and consider taking further steps towards abolition. We are excited about the opportunities that come with the political debates about the fallacies of the death penalty, which are ongoing in states like Arizona, Arkansas, California, Ohio, and Oklahoma in this regard. And we see a positive trend on the highest level since the Supreme Court has ruled unconstitutional the use of capital punishment in cases of mental illness and cases involving children. These changes take time. The Supreme Court didn't rule the execution in case of mental illness unconstitutional until 2002, and for crimes involving juveniles as recently as 2005. But we expect and hope that the Supreme Court will sustain this level of engagement and decision-making. We know from our own experience in Europe that it takes extraordinary leadership to change the status quo on this matter. But leadership does not emerge in isolation. We also need civil society to drive these efforts, and the impact of public opinion should not be understated. This holds particularly true in this modern age, the age of social media and its global reach at the touch of a screen. In our work, we support individual cases whenever we can in close consultation with our member states. We provide a platform for partners, and we facilitate behind-the-scenes dialogue with the aim to strengthen the abolition movement. Many organizations in the United States have also received funding from the European Union Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights. And on a global level, Europe works hard to amplify these voices, your voices. Just last month, we launched the Global Alliance for Torture-Free Trade during the UN General Assembly, thanks to the joint leadership of Mongolia, Argentina, and the European Union. But I will let my colleague from the Mongolian Embassy tell you more about this global initiative and its potential impact on capital punishment. In a related effort, Brussels will host the 7th World Congress Against the Death Penalty in February 2019. The European Union is proud to support the work done by the Eighth Amendment Project, Witness to Innocence, American Bar Association, Reprieve, and the Death Penalty Information Center. And we are very proud to have experts and representatives from these organizations join us today. This evening, we ask what should be a simple question, a question which nonetheless reveals the various intricate layers of complexities that go hand in hand with an advocacy effort in a country as large and diverse as the United States. Which state will be next to abolish the death penalty? We want to hear from them and from you in the discussion that will follow what the possible tipping points are for state governments across the country to abolish the death penalty. How could these take shape in the coming years, and what can we, as the friends and allies of the United States, Europe, do to support these efforts? On this note, I'd like to thank you all once again for coming here this evening. I'm honored that Congressman Johnson from Georgia's 4th District will speak to us later this evening. Both of us addressed the General Assembly of the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty here at the Catholic University in D.C. last June, and I'm particularly thankful for his leadership in advancing the abolitionist movement, and he will join us later once he has completed some pressing business on the Hill. It's now my pleasure, ladies and gentlemen, to give the floor to my esteemed colleague, Mr. Bat-Ochir, Chargé d'Affaires of the Embassy of Mongolia, and I look very much forward to our discussions this evening. Please, Mr. Chargé d'Affaires.
Thank you, Ambassador, Your Excellencies, colleagues and friends. It is my great pleasure to be here at this event on the occasion of the World and Europe Day Against the Death Penalty. International law bans torture in all circumstances. Taking lives of and torturing our fellow human beings are brutal and unjustifiable under any circumstances. Non-violence and compassion for every human being should be held in high regard. Just last month, together with our colleagues from the European Union and the Argentina, we launched an initiative, the Global Alliance to End Trade in Goods Used for Capital, Punishment, and Torture. The initiative brings together countries from around the world to end the trade in goods used to carry out the death penalty and torture. The countries of the alliance commit themselves to take measures to control and restrict exports of such products. At the same time, we also want to monitor trade routes and exchange information in order to put an end to this trade. Mongolia is firmly committed to protecting human rights and the fight against torture and inhuman degrading treatment. We are one of the Asia-Pacific countries that has recently abolished the death penalty. Mongolia abolished death penalty in 2015 by adopting a new criminal code without any reference to capital punishment and ratified the second option protocol to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights in 2012. Judging by our experience, if political and public wills would merge in one point and support each other, it is possible to abolish the death penalty in a relatively short period of time. And finally, we believe that the Global Alliance will play an important role in eradicating death penalty, torture, and inhuman degrading treatment around the world. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Robert Dunham. I'm the Executive Director of the Death Penalty Information Center. Welcome to our panel discussion today for abolishing capital punishment, which U.S. states will be next. Let me set the landscape for you. When people talk about the death penalty in the United States, the general assumption is that we're dealing with a national policy that's practiced broadly. The fact of the matter is that's not the case. In 2013, we did a study on the way the death penalty was administered in the United States and discovered that 56% of all death sentences in the United States emanated from fewer than 2% of all the counties in the country. That means essentially that 98% of the country is responsible for a very small portion of death row. And in fact, 85% of the counties in the United States don't have anybody who is on death row. So the notion of the death penalty as being a national policy, as being something that represents the views not just of the federal government, but the views of American citizens as a whole, is just not true. Fewer than 2% of the counties account for more than half of the executions and more than 56% of everybody who's on death row. Now, things in the country have changed, and they've changed at all levels. We've seen from the 1990s to the present a plummeting in the number of new death sentences. In 1994 and 1996, this country imposed 315 new death sentences in a single year. Last year, the total was 31. In 1999, there were 98 executions in the United States. Last year, there were 20. Now, it's not just a one-year change. Those are substantial numbers. It is an ongoing 20-year trend. And you can measure it as well in public opinion polls, because in the late 1990s, support for the death penalty is measured by Pew and is measured by the Gallup poll, had support up at the levels of 80% for Gallup, 78% for Pew. Last year, Gallup had public support for the death penalty at 60%, and Pew, for the first time in the history of its poll, had public support for the death penalty under 50% at 49%. The level of support for the death penalty was the lowest it's been since the United States Supreme Court declared the death penalty unconstitutional in 1972, and opposition to the death penalty was at the highest level since that time. We're seeing an ongoing trend. And when you are looking at the way the death penalty is administered, who is next, who is abolishing, who isn't abolishing, who is adding the death penalty, what we're seeing is a trend that's been going in one direction only. In the 21st century, 7 states have eliminated the death penalty and no one has added it. And even within the states that have the death penalty, it's being eliminated, county by county, prosecutor by prosecutor. I said that 2% of the counties in the United States produced more than 56% of the death penalties. A lot of those death penalties are concentrated in a very few number of what we call outlier counties that overproduce death sentences. And in the last 2 years, voters have taken it upon themselves to change who's at the top in the prosecuting offices in those counties. 5 of the prosecutors in the counties that produced the 16 most death sentences in the United States in the last 5 years are now out. And new prosecutors who have pledged criminal justice reform, including reduced use of the death penalty, are now in. And now the 3rd largest death penalty county in the United States, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, has a district attorney's election coming up in less than a month, and the leading candidate, who has a Democratic nomination and is considered a prohibitive favorite to win the election, has run on a pledge not to impose the death penalty. So we're seeing a very real and substantial change in the United States. This is what we see no matter what we look at: polls, sentences, executions. The question is it sustainable? Where is it going? Who's next? And that's why we have a distinguished panel here, and we're going to ask them one at a time to come up and talk with you. And I'll start with an introductory question to Henderson Hill, who is the Executive Director of the Eighth Amendment Project, which is involved in a national campaign to bring about a reform or abolition of capital punishment. And so, Henderson, the question I have for you, abolishing capital punishment, which U.S. states will be next? The question is not just which states will be next, but is that the right question to ask?
Well, it's not the question I would ask, but it is a good question. I take it almost as a celebration of what's happened in the last decade. I mean, if we look at the last decade, we've had 7 states abolish the death penalty. That's cause for celebration. And it also invites people to ask, okay, if you did that, what's next? So in that light, I think it's a good question. If we take the last 2 states to have abolished the death penalty, you see a little bit of the concern about whether it's the right question. You know, the state of Nebraska abolished the death penalty. That was a remarkable accomplishment for the United States. You know, politically speaking, Nebraska is a red state, a deeply red state, a conservative state. So unlike New York, New Jersey, Maryland, Nebraska, when it took its action, you know, the whole world stood up. Now, you got to understand, when I say the whole world, there is such a thing called American exceptionalism. And so when one of our 50 states, a red one, stands up like that, we think the whole world took notice. Well, the United States took notice. Unfortunately, the billionaire governor of that state also took notice, and he personally funded an effort at the ballot box and brought that state back into the retentionist column. So Nebraska was a state that we invested years, 7 years of political activity by the folks in this row and partners beyond this row into Nebraska. And we won at the political level. We passed repeal. We overrode a veto. These are hard, almost impossible things to do, and we did it. We fell a couple of $1 billion short, and that's regrettable. Look at Delaware. Delaware went into the abolition column last year. Again, another state that we invested years in. These folks in the front row and partners throughout the country. We invested those funds for a legislative effort, judicial effort. You know, we were working the Attorney General in the state of Delaware, and it took all 3 arms of government to do that. In the end, we ended the death penalty by way of judicial action, the decision of the High Court. So I take the question, Rob, as an affirmation of what we've done well over the last decade. But where I would direct the question is to the decision in 2015 by the Supreme Court in Glossop v. Gross. And more importantly, to the dissent by Justice Breyer in that decision. What he did was give us a different paradigm. You can look at the states and look at the 50 states, but what Robert said earlier was so important. And what was important in that decision is that a justice spoke it. Justice Breyer said, you look at the 3,100 counties in America, and it's the counties where criminal justice is applied. Out of those 3,100 counties, only 15 regularly use the death penalty. We can now update Justice Breyer, it's down to 10. That's remarkable. If you want to go by states, listen to what Justice Ginsburg said at the end of last term. She said that the number of states, first of all, she said that the death penalty it looks like it's going to go away by way of attrition, just failure to use it, reduction of use. And then what she went on to say is that right now, she sees only 3 states that regularly use it. That's what she said at, I think it was Georgetown Law School. Now, I would have a little quibble with Justice Ginsburg. I would look and say there are 5, 6 states. But whether it's 3, 4, 5, or 6, the remarkable thing is the death penalty is being abandoned by Americans left and right. And Chargé D'Affaires, Bolt, it's actions like Mongolia that give us encouragement. Because that's what we anticipate happening here. And when we say and I heard Ambassador Sullivan at Catholic University, and it was remarkably encouraging to have you come and speak at the World Congress. When we think about what's happened over the last 15 years, we can look at the United States Supreme Court jurisprudence, and you can hear the echoes of the EU. You can hear the echoes of the European thought on this. What have the case laws said in the last 15 years? Folks with intellectual disability, it would be unconscionable to subject them to this penalty. It would be inhuman. What does the European Union, what does civilized world say about executing juveniles? It's unconscionable. Well, what is unconscionable as a matter of international law was daily fare for years. But it was the bold, consistent standing of the civilized world that got worked through. The professional associations in this country, mental health and otherwise, and that international standard is now part of the national standard. The notion, we used to hang people in Salem, Massachusetts for all sorts of fornication and witchcraft. And for years, it was black men in the South who were being lynched and or sentenced to death because of alleged sexual violations. Well, in the last 15 years, the Supreme Court has said loudly and clearly that sexual offenses short of homicide are no longer eligible for the death penalty. These are all retrenchments, shrinking of the death penalty that's critically important. The ambassador is going to be in Philadelphia in just a couple of days. The state of Pennsylvania has a governor who has taken a moral position, has taken that position not as a position of faith. He's a businessman. He acts by logic. He's seen the operation of the system is broken. And he has said in Pennsylvania it won't happen. It won't happen in that state while he's governor. Remarkably, the largest city in that state will in November elect a district attorney who will take a similar position. This is incredible change. This is progress. This is why we have the encouragement that the death penalty in the United States is in its last chapter. So it's sort of a long-winded way of getting around to your question. But yeah, I would be troubled to say which state is next. I mean, some would say Utah, others are looking at Wyoming. I'm from North Carolina. Yeah, I think in the next 3 to 5 years, that's a little bit longer window than I would prefer. But if you look at the next 3 to 5 window, you'd have to put North Carolina in the mix. Louisiana is in that same window. But what gives me encouragement is looking at Alabama, looking at Florida, looking at Texas. Look at those states where they will, I hate to say it, they will never pass a repeal bill in Alabama, Texas, or Florida. But will we end the death penalty there? Just last year, 164 folks from the row are being given relief in Florida as a result of one case by the Supreme Court. That same case ended the death penalty in Delaware. That same case brings promise that Alabama's corrupt and broken system may finally be disciplined and come up to the level of the other states. Now, that's not a whole lot, because these are actually retentionist states and those systems are broken. But just imagine, Alabama is so broken that it's a major improvement that they be brought up to the level of the other retentionist states, and that's what we're seeing. So, Rob, I don't know, and I won't guarantee that we've got a state that's right next in terms of 2018, 2019, but what I can guarantee you is that the death penalty's end is within sight. We're ending it county by county, and it's remarkable the statistics that you quoted about even where we are this year, the year of Trump, because under the radar, we're squeezing the death penalty. Thank you.
Thank you, Henderson. At the Death Penalty Information Center, we're all about numbers, so let me give you a couple numbers. Henderson is from North Carolina. In 1992 to 1996, that 5-year period, North Carolina sentenced 140 people to death. In the last 5-year period, 2012 to 2016, North Carolina sentenced 5 people to death. That means for every person who was sentenced to death in the last 5 years in North Carolina, there were 28 people who had been condemned a generation before. I'm from Philadelphia. And so what we saw on the state level in North Carolina, we're seeing also on the county level in my hometown, where in the 1990s, we were having in one city an average of 9.9 death sentences per year. And in the last 5 years, there have been 3 death sentences. So what we're seeing is something that's not confined to any one region in the country. We're seeing activity across the country, and it's all tending in that same direction. Now, Henderson was discussing what happens with the prospects for abolition. There are some states that are not necessarily ready for abolition, but have had a lot of issues with the way in which death penalty is being carried out, and there are a lot of efforts that have been underway to try to define what they can do to improve, or at least have a factual basis for determining whether there should or shouldn't be a death penalty. And the American Bar Association Due Process Review Project has looked very hard at a lot of these states and is working in a number of states trying to determine what the practices are, what the practices should be, whether people are complying with international standards, national standards, and so forth. And we're privileged to have with us Misty Thomas, who is the director of the ABA Death Penalty Due Process Project. And I guess the question I have for you is what's going on in the states that aren't quite ready now, and what steps are being undertaken in those states that are curtailing the use of the death penalty.
Thank you so much, Rob, and thank you so much for having me. So there are lots of those states that are in that middle space, right? That they're not so deeply entrenched that they're unwilling to look at the issue of the death penalty at all. They're not the states that are maybe on the cusp and really there's a space for talking about abolition and you want to facilitate that space. But what do you do with those in the middle where their citizens are troubled? They're hearing about the cases that should trouble them, the facts and the stories, and their policymakers are listening and maybe are receptive to taking some reform. And I think that is a space where an organization like the American Bar Association, which does not take a moral position on the death penalty, has not taken a position for abolition, but does say, for a long time we've had the position of saying there should be a suspension of executions anywhere where you don't have confidence that these executions are being handled fairly, accurately, and with meaningful due process. And truth be told, we've found problems in all of those arenas, both at the federal level, internationally, and in each of the states that we've examined closely. And so we think that there are a variety of types of reforms going on in the states, but I'm going to spend my time today talking about the severe mental illness exemption legislation and efforts. So unfortunately, it's always rude to come to someone's space and disagree with the host, but I will actually disagree with the ambassador to the extent that severe mental illness is not yet something that the Supreme Court has actually tackled head-on as a reasonable exemption. And we'll talk in a minute. I'm going to deputize all of you as spokespeople for this, but we've gotten there with intellectual disability in 2002. We've gotten there with juveniles or youthful offenders in 2005, but severe mental illness is a space where there's still a lot of work to be done, but a lot of energy. And so that's something that we've been working on at my office for a couple of years, because it really is, at least legislatively on the state level, the trend where I think people see a space for a clear, moral, legal, and policy-based position to make some change. And I think part of that is because it really does bring together some unlikely allies. So it's very often conservative-led effort, and it also brings and new voices, people who are not necessarily talking about the death penalty as part of their regular mission. So that's mental health organizations, that's victims' family organizations. Well, and faith groups, while they're certainly involved, have a different tenor when they want to talk about the death penalty and people with disabilities. So I told you a little bit about the ABA's broad position, but they do, fortunately, while not taking an abolition position, want to devote resources and energy to making sure that if we're going to do this, if there's going to be an ultimate punishment, that it is critical for an organization of the nation's lawyers to care about this balanced, fair, data-principled approach to looking at the death penalty and really trying to make sure that our system is just. And so we work on both policy, advocacy, research, and public education to try to further fairness and accuracy. And one of the initiatives that we've been working on is our mental health initiative, where we're working with state coalitions. We'll talk a little bit about what they're doing in just a second, but I'm going to start with some definitions quickly. So what do I mean when I say severe mental illness and you're hearing this term? We don't mean all mental illnesses. We don't mean anyone that has had a clinical diagnosis, but it's usually that narrower subset of diagnoses that profoundly impact people's daily function. So we're talking usually schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, schizoaffective disorder, things that come with delusions, hallucinations, major cognitive impairments in functioning. Sometimes that includes major depressive disorder and PTSD under some understandings. And so, you may have heard things like, well, isn't there competency to stand trial already built in our system? Isn't there the insanity defense? Can't you raise evidence of disabilities in the sentencing phase? We posit, and the ABA has posited for a long time, that those are insufficient mechanisms, and it's a detailed thing to go through each one, but let's say that happens in way less than 1% of any case. They don't protect people from the ultimate punishment adequately, has been our position and the position of the leading mental health organizations for a long time. And so, because they're too rare and too ineffective, there's still a gap. We are still executing in this country people with severe mental illness. We're talking about states we're from. I'm from Texas. My home state is this year still trying to execute a man with severe mental illness, a man with profound intellectual disability. This is still happening, and I think there's a myth that we're not doing this anymore, but we are. And so the proposals of an organization like the American Bar Association and the things we're seeing in legislatures are not to say that there wouldn't be punishment. They are not the equivalent of sending someone to a state mental hospital forever. They would be found culpable for their crime, but they would take the death penalty off the table. They would say, you are not the worst of the worst. You are not who the death penalty is intended for, with the presumption that that state is going to keep the death penalty on the table. So a little bit of a legal parallel primer, just quickly, but you have heard about Atkins, which is the 2002 decision to exempt people with intellectual disability. You've heard about the 2005 decision to exempt juveniles. And we would say that the line of legal logic extends very directly to people with severe mental illness. And the courts gave us some roadmaps there too. So just like the Glossop dissent gave us some roadmaps, those decisions looked at trends in legislative changes. So that's what we're trying to do right now, because there's not yet any state that's adopted a severe mental illness exemption. But the court looked to that when they decided these other exemptions. So we're working on it, and we'll certainly look to partners in this room for support in those efforts. They looked at decreased use of the practice around the country. That's harder to track because there hasn't been great data about severe mental illness, but we're trying to gather some more information on that. And broader social and professional consensus. So that includes all of the prominent mental illness organizations, which we have, the American Psychological Association, NAMI, which is the National Alliance on Mental Illness, Mental Health America. You name it, those big national organizations with expertise on mental illness feel that this is the next frontier, and they also oppose the death penalty for people with severe mental illness. And polling, they look at national polling, 72% in a 2015 poll, 72% of likely voters, when they understand what this policy would do, support exempting people with severe mental illness from the death penalty. They looked to international positions, and of course, that they looked in both of those cases to the EU position, the UN's position, and fortunately we have partnership in that as well in this area, so we are making progress. And then the court also looked at the relative culpability, and that's sort of where I started. People with profound mental illnesses are, I think, logically just like those with intellectual disability and juveniles in the sense that they don't have that same ultimate culpability, right? That sense that they are the worst of the worst if you're going to buy that framework for the death penalty because of their impairments, because of their disabilities, and sort of their just diminished capacities. And the penological purposes of the death penalty don't fit for those folks, right? They're not going to be deterred from the death penalty if they are truly people with diagnosed profound severe mental illnesses. They are not really going to fit the retribution goal. So we are working to really try to highlight this issue, to educate the court, the legislatures, and the citizens to say, look, this is a logical extension of what the court's already done, and to highlight how this is a continued flaw in the continued practice of the death penalty around this country. But the court has not gotten there yet, and the legislatures have not gotten there yet. So we're working with coalitions all across the country. And in fact, right now, 40% of all of the existing capital punishment states have coalitions focused on this effort. So 14 to 15 states, depending on how you count it, of the 31, are examining severe mental illness exception bills. And so it is a big trend. It is part of this what's happening now and what's happening next conversation. And that's gone up from 4 bills in 2015, 2016, 8 bills in the 2016-2017 legislature, and we're looking down the pike at 13 to 14 in the coming years. So there's an energy growing around this. These mental health organizations I talked about are really taking this on as theirs, and I think we welcome that. They are partners saying, we will lead the charge on this in the states. And most all of the bills are conservative sponsored. So this is a space for folks who are not yet ready to be out front on abolition, or maybe are never going to be, but they are willing to say, I'm very troubled by how the death penalty is used in my state, the intersection of our criminal justice system generally with people with disabilities, people in poverty, people who are not getting other services that might have prevented these crimes. And so they're great allies for moving this. And even if they are not abolition leaders, they're thinking about the death penalty now, maybe for the first time in a long time. And I think that's to our good, and we should really facilitate that. So we're working with those coalitions, and like I mentioned a lot of the progress, but we're very encouraged. There's been lots of media attention on this issue in the last couple of years. Those coalitions continue to grow. We're getting positive votes out of committees in Ohio, in Texas, even in early years of the bill being introduced. So there is a growing energy, and there's a space for all of us to be talking and breaking myths about how mental health is handled in the death penalty cases now, to encouraging our legislatures to act in this way and encouraging the courts. We're certainly also trying to get these resources to litigators who are raising this in their cases because it's happening a lot. So I think that that's sort of a quickie, down and dirty overview of why we think it's both legally sound and there's policy energy towards this reform. And I do think it brings voices in the spaces where there's not going to be other action, but this is a place where people can start talking about all of those prongs, because this also does. People with mental illness, and we'll hear from my colleague in a minute, are more likely to be wrongfully convicted because of they're more likely to be misunderstood at trial. They're more likely to be misperceived in the course of the trial. So there's a lot of things about process that you kind of turn a light on for people as they think about this issue, and then can think more broadly about problems with the death penalty. So it's an exciting frontier. We produced some research on it. There's copies out front if you want to see some of the scholarship, and we're happy to help if it's something you're working on in your state or member states of the EU want to get more involved in. So thank you.
Thank you, Misty. You know, one of the things that we've noticed time after time is that whether it's a judge in an individual case, a voter who is trying to decide what the policy should be, legislators, whoever's making decisions on the death penalty, facts are one thing, feelings are another. And the way people's minds change with the death penalty is often because something happens that makes them feel different. Mental illness can be one of those issues. Right now, the state of Arkansas has scheduled the execution of a gentleman by the name of Jack Green. Jack Green is delusional. Jack Green delusionally believes that his central nervous system has been destroyed and that the Arkansas Department of Corrections and his lawyers have conspired against him. He is someone who is so delusional that he has somatic symptoms. That is, he is getting physical symptoms from his psychological disorder, to the point that to prevent his constant pain, he jams his orifices with paper. And so you see pictures of him with blood coming out of his nose because he's stuffed paper up his nose on a regular basis. His official picture from the Department of Corrections had him with his face stuffed with this paper and blood on his face. He's going to be executed unless a court finds that he is mentally incompetent, which is mentally incompetent to be executed requires such severe mental illness that you don't have an understanding of why it is that you were sentenced to death, or that you're sentenced to death, or what an execution is actually going to be, or what the execution is for. And when people see individuals like that being taken and being executed, many have this inner revulsion. And it's that change of feeling that changes their picture about the death penalty. There's another thing that has changed the picture in the way that people look at the death penalty in the United States over the last several years. And it doesn't have to do with the death penalty being arbitrarily sought or arbitrarily imposed. The fact that if you committed a killing on one side of the county line, you wouldn't face death, and on the other you would, or that one state would have it and one didn't, or the personality of a prosecutor. There's another thing that has been changing the way people think about the death penalty, and that's the lengths to which states have been going to try to carry it out, and the problems that they have had with lethal injection executions, botched executions, and all sorts of questionable conduct that the states are undertaking in order to carry out these executions. And we're lucky to have with us Mark Mayer from Reprieve, which is an international human rights organization that has been extraordinarily active working with the pharmaceuticological community around the world and with people in states across the United States in trying to address the issue of what do you do about drugs and the death penalty. So that's my question for you. What do you do about drugs and the death penalty and this whole concept of states breaking the law to carry out the law?
Thank you, Rob. Just as a little bit of background for those of you who don't know, like Rob said, Reprieve is an international human rights organization. What we do is we work on individual capital cases in the U.S., including a number of European nationals on death row in the United States. And we also use strategic advocacy to help end the death penalty in the United States and around the world. In addition to this extensive casework, as Rob mentioned, Reprieve has helped more than 30 pharmaceutical companies stop the misuse of their drugs in executions in the United States. And since we've started working on this about 6 years ago, all 30 of these companies have instituted policies, have instituted controls to stop these drugs from being misused. And Reprieve has been a partner in helping to change this principled opposition into actual concrete controls. These laudable efforts by the companies have really enormously changed the death penalty landscape and system in the United States. And the change in the system has led to a number of questions in the minds of observers. And I'd like to use about 4 of those questions to kind of highlight the work that we do and give an update of where everything is now. And the first question is, this is obviously an abolitionist position. Reprieve works to help end the death penalty in the United States. The question is, has pharma always held this position? And I want to be very clear on this. This movement, since the beginning, has been led by the pharmaceutical industry. Pharma, from the beginning, has opposed the misuse of their medicines in executions, and this makes a lot of sense when you think about it. These people have developed these drugs to save, maintain, and improve lives, not to end the lives of prisoners in lethal injection executions. And since 2011, when Lundbeck became the first global manufacturer of these drugs to really constructively restrict the distributions of these drugs, more than 40 pharmaceutical manufacturers and distributors have implemented controls to stop the misuse of their drugs in lethal injection executions. I want to be clear, this represents the unanimous opinion across all of the pharmaceutical industry. Should be clear, of course, that there is a commercial dimension to this. The pharmaceutical companies understand that if their drugs are misused, they face a number of risks. They face costly litigation, they face negative media attention, and they face divestment from important shareholders. But at the same time, this is more than just a commercial concern for these companies. I know we like to imagine that's all that Big Pharma cares about, but it really is a matter of principle for them. These people have devoted their lives to developing life-saving drugs, and it's difficult for them to see them misused in lethal injection executions. What's more, the way that these executions are carried out essentially is human experimentation by prison officials who have no medical training would send the chill up the spine of any healthcare official, let alone those who've devoted years and years to researching and improving drugs and take real pride in the research that they've done and the years that they've spent in this. To be clear, of course, this is not merely I want to be clear about the principle that these companies stand for, and it's that they do not want their drugs to be misused in executions. It's not an opposition to the death penalty per se, though there are certainly people in the pharmaceutical industry who oppose the death penalty. In fact, this is actually the position of the American Medical Association, whose formal policy states that an individual position on the morality or immorality of the death penalty is up to the moral discretion of that individual. But a physician who is part of a profession whose job is to save lives, even when there is only a small chance of actually saving that life, should not be participating in a legally mandated execution. So that leads to the second question. It's probably one that you're thinking. Surely these states are going to get the drugs from someplace else. That if these companies are saying we're not going to supply these to states, that other companies are just going to step in and provide the drugs. That's actually not what we've seen. No companies have stepped in to fill the gap. As Rob mentioned, the vast majority of states have been unable to find these drugs. And in fact, this year, nearly 74% of executing states carried out no executions, actually. At the same time, about a half of the executions that were carried out by only 2 states. Texas, and Arkansas. And both of those states were forced to use illicit and possibly illegal means to get the drugs that they used. In contrast, the vast majority of states have been unable to get a hold of these drugs, and it's actually led a number of these states to turn, legislatively at least, to alternative methods of execution, such as the firing squad in Utah or the electric chair in Tennessee. The critical point, of course, is that it is illegal for these states to buy or import non-FDA approved drugs for the use and execution. And these laws are enforced, as both Texas and Arizona found out, when the DEA actually seized shipments from a non-FDA supplier that Texas and Arizona intended to use in their lethal injection. Today, every FDA-approved manufacturer of these drugs opposes the use of their drugs in capital punishment. So the only way for states to get these drugs is to use these illicit and illegal means to get their fix. Of course, luckily, only a small minority of states have been that reckless. Other states, every time they've tried to cast a net to try to get a hold of these drugs in some other way, have run up against roadblocks. Missouri in 2014 is a very good example of this. Missouri's attorney general came out publicly and said, well, we can't get these drugs, so we'll just manufacture them ourselves. 3 years later, they're unable to manufacture them because states realize that it is incredibly costly and complicated to actually make these drugs. The next question I want to address is whether or not this is solely a European issue, that Europe has led on this issue. As Henderson mentioned, we have kind of this sense of American exceptionalism that really plays out when you hear people kind of objecting to, well, these are just European companies coming in and trying to tell Americans how to run their country. But the truth is that US pharmaceutical companies have been just as tenacious in opposing the use of their drugs in capital punishment. In fact, it was a US company, Abbott, back in 2001, that was the first company to publicly oppose the misuse of their medicines and executions 10 years before Lundbeck instituted controls. In addition, just last year, Pfizer, an enormous drug manufacturer in the US and around the world, implemented a policy that effectively stops their drugs from being sent on to death rows around the country. And a number of other US pharmaceutical companies have taken the same position, including companies like Sagent and Acorn and Par. The last question I want to address is one that I kind of have already brought up, and that's if states can't get these drugs, aren't they just going to move to other methods of execution? Isn't this just going to make it worse? I just mentioned that a number of states have introduced legislatively things like the gas chamber, things like electrocution. And it's true that states have moved legislatively on this issue, but it's very important to note that none of them have actually carried out an execution using one of these methods. None of them have carried out an execution using these methods, even though they have been blocked time and time again from their efforts in diverting drugs and misusing them in lethal injection executions in opposition to companies. Why is that? It can't be from lack of supplies or lack of knowledge. We've done this before in the United States. Think about the risk to a state official, to a governor, being the first governor in the modern era to carry out a lethal injection by the gas chamber, or being the first governor in the modern era to have the Supreme Court rebuke them from carrying out lethal injection using the gas chamber. The truth is, governors and state officials have shown us and continue to show us every day that there are serious legal and reputational risks in turning to alternative methods of execution that they are simply not willing to take. And finally, I think this says something about the nature of the death penalty in the United States that is very, very important. And that's that lethal injection is at the heart of American capital punishment. It has lended a false sense of medical legitimacy to the death penalty for years, even at the same time that other methods have fallen out of public favor, like electrocution, like hanging, like the firing squad. But that medical mask is starting to fall away. And it's starting to fall away because of the opposition of pharmaceutical companies and healthcare professionals. More and more Americans, as Rob has said, just last year we had a poll that said American support of the death penalty has fallen below 50%. And that's in large part due to America is starting to reject a method of capital punishment that Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor described as the chemical equivalent of being burned at the stake. And that opposition is due in large part to the efforts of pharmaceutical companies that continue to this day. Thanks, Rob.
Thank you. Now, when we think about lethal injection and what states are doing to try to carry out executions, one of the ongoing problems that states are having is how do we go about carrying out this legal punishment in a manner that comports with the law. They don't want to be seen as violating the law to carry out the law. And yet, we see in every state that's carried out an execution, I think in the last 5 years at least, that the execution process has been shrouded in secrecy. And it's that secrecy that is permitting the states to engage in all sorts of conduct. Essentially, they're saying, trust me, we're the government, and you don't have to look any further. What we've seen in instance after instance when the veil of secrecy has been pierced is that what goes on behind that veil is highly questionable. Recently in Arkansas, we saw that all 3 of the drugs that the state was attempting to use, well, they did use in carrying out 4 executions, had been obtained under different questionable circumstances. In one case, the state was sued for affirmatively misrepresenting what they were going to be using the medicines for. And in another case, they simply didn't say what they were going to use the medicines for, but certainly not a medical purpose, but they left McKesson Company under the impression that it was going to be purchased for medical use. And so you have these states who are using secrecy to thwart the democratic process, to thwart public oversight, and to try to keep a system that is failing more and more to try to keep it operating. I thought it was very interesting that just last week in the United Nations Committee on Human Rights, there was a resolution that was passed that for the first time and laudably condemned the use of the death penalty for religious belief and based on same-sex relationships. But also one of the fundamental parts of that resolution was a recognition that transparency is absolutely essential to the death penalty. And while we think of transparency in the international context about secret death penalty practices, we don't know whether someone's been sentenced to death, they just sort of disappear. We don't know whether someone is getting due process because information's not available about them. We don't know specifics about types of cases because the countries are not releasing them. An analogous human rights violation may well be occurring in the United States. As in every execution, what happens is shrouded behind a veil of secrecy. Now, that's not a very good transition to our next thing. But, you know, lethal injection, the problems with lethal injection have been one of those things that have changed the way that people feel about the death penalty. But probably more than almost anything else, the face of the death penalty in the United States has changed as the public becomes more and more aware that people who are innocent have been wrongly caught up in the net, wrongly convicted, wrongly condemned, sadly, in a growing number of cases, wrongly executed. But we now have evidence witnessed by 159 separate individuals that people who did not commit the crime have been convicted and sentenced to death and subsequently, fortunately, exonerated. And we're privileged to have with us Magdalena Rose-Avila from Witness to Innocence. And the question that I want to ask you is, these exonerees are, in many respects, the face of what is the most dangerous thing that can happen with the death penalty. What are they doing to try to change the picture of the death penalty across the country and affect public opinion and have people come to understand what the real risks of capital punishment are?
hay que decir no a la pena de muerte. We have to say no to the death penalty in many languages, not just English. It has to be a worldwide movement from many cultures and many people who say no to the death penalty. You know, we're fighting for our lives, those of us who are witness to innocence. We're fighting for their lives. Everyone who is on death row, our folks who come off death row, they feel bad about the people they left behind, about the numbers of people that they saw executed while they were on death row. And so they come out and maintain communication with the people on the row, and they come out to fight for their lives because we must change it. We must make it more humane. Last week, we heard about one of our board members, an exoneree from Louisiana, John Thompson, better known as JT, who passed away suddenly. And we as WTI, Witness to Innocence, have a number of actions that we're taking to keep his spirit alive, to get a little bit of justice for him. And so I want Jeannie, who's in our office, to raise her hand, because she's controlling all of the actions that we're doing in behalf of JT. You know, JT, he's a great man. When you see exonerees with the kind of spirit and humor to come out and fight against the death penalty after everything went wrong with them. And, you know, he would tell us, you have to keep working at it. And, you know, maybe I can help you with the answer that Rob tried to give you, you know, that curveball about when are you going to, the next date that's going to be executed. You know, it's hard to tell. When I study history, nobody could predict when women's suffragette movement would give women the right to vote. Who predicted that? Who had predicted the gains that Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement would have? Who would predict that? There was no prediction that you could make, no betting in Las Vegas on that. And Nelson Mandela. For those of us who worked so many years to free Nelson Mandela, who could predict when Nelson Mandela would come out? It did not stop us from doing the work, right? We said, this is an injustice and we're going to work for it. And we're doing the same with the death penalty. We're going to keep working because we don't have an exact barometer that's going to tell us when the tipping point comes. But we have to stay at it. Who would have known Mongolia was going to come out as an abolitionist country? Nobody could have predicted that. Maybe y'all had a calendar, but it wasn't on ours. But we're happy. And that's why when you work for human rights, you have to continue to fight. You know, John Thompson, when the day that I heard that he was passed away, the next day he was going to come to us to work with us in Santa Clara County with our first program. This is a very unique program that's funded by the European Commission and by the Luss Foundation. And we call it Advocacy and Justice. This is a program where we take 3 exonerees and one of our attorneys, and one of our attorneys is Dick Dieter, who's a board member who's sitting over here, who they facilitate these meetings. So we take 3 exonerees, we meet with district attorneys, and we talk about what went wrong in the cases and what corrections they could make and how they affect a human life. And John Thompson's was the key case that we were going to talk about because the DA's office had studied that case because it was absurd about what happened to John Thompson in all of the process. And we just had the first session. We had 20 senior district attorneys in a room with 2 of our exonerees and Elizabeth Zitron, one of our attorneys and board members. And it was amazing, the conversation we had, because what happens with the police and the district attorneys, that's where they make the decisions about seeking the harsh punishments. And that's where we need to educate them. And so on the 23rd in Philadelphia, we have 6 other district attorneys who are coming with their staff, and us with Fair and Just Punishment, the Innocence Project, the Patron Center, and others. We will again present to those district attorneys how they can make their systems better. This is where, you know, when we thought about it 2 years ago, we thought, well, this is a crazy idea. Would district attorneys want to talk to us? But, you know, we're getting more offers. Just this last week, the police of Aurora, where they've had horrible shootings, has asked us to come in and do a workshop. City Attorney's Office in Seattle has asked us to come in and do a workshop for them because there are good people who may be in bad offices, and so we want to help them move them and educate them. So it's very exciting because most of these district attorneys have never met somebody that was wrongfully convicted. They just wanted the win, no matter what the price was and the suffering was. So we're very excited. We really, the EC was the first one to embrace this program, which is a radical program for us. What happens with us is that we defend people who've really been jilted by the system. John Thompson, like a lot of exonerees, never get compensation. He spent 14 years in prison. The jury gave him $14 million judgment. And the state and the city fought it all the way to the Supreme Court. And unfortunately, Clarence Thomas wrote one of the worst decisions he could have ever written in his lifetime and in the history of the court. And they took the $14 million away from John Thompson. And I say this because that case has injured a lot of compensation issues for exonerees who get nothing after the state and the city has wronged them. So in the case of John Thompson, we're going to carry on that fight. We're going to go after the prosecutors. We're going to see that justice comes. And when we talk about when will a state turn, as we all know that John Thompson and 3 more of our exonerees this past year went to the Louisiana legislature and they fought to get the abolition bill out of the committee. We missed it by 1 vote, and that's happened in a number of states. And so when attorneys and our other friends, Ben Cohen and others, talked to John Thompson right after the hearing, and instead of being disheartened, they'd thrown everything at John Thompson over the course of his history. And every time they threw a negative out, he said, you know what, we're not stopping. We know it's unjust, and you got to keep fighting. And we have to, because there's lives at stake. And if John Thompson would not quit, you must help us to get justice. And just so you know the connection to the World Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty, John Thompson was also with us. And he was there because he understands that as much as this is a case for us to fight in our country, we have a responsibility also from the United States to talk about countries who, like the United States, use the death penalty too often and too carelessly. So that's why John Thompson was along with Dick Dieter and a bunch of us, we were there at the World Coalition because we need a unified front. Human rights, that's how you make changes in human rights, by doing that. And the World Coalition's focus this year is on poverty. And we know that poverty affects the death penalty in particular in countries all over the world, but also poverty and race play major factors in what happens to our citizens in this country. We are not powerless. All of us who are in this room or watching this program from afar know that you can make a difference. We have seen, since I got involved in the death penalty in 1985, we have seen the power of the Europeans, of the EU in helping us save lives, abolish death penalty in states. We've seen where the voices of our exonerees in every of the 7 states where they abolished the death penalty, where they played a big role, because a legislator can't say that the judicial system is fair and just when they see what they've done to these individuals. So our members are dedicated to working to abolish the death penalty and to make the reforms that we need so that everybody is treated justly within our judicial system. So I ask you tonight, know that we can do the impossible. We just have to be willing to do a little bit more hard work. All of us in this room and everybody listening, we have the power to end the death penalty, not just in the United States, but we're going to go after Iran and some other folks because we want every life, no matter what border they're within, has the same value, and no government should take anyone's life. Join us. Let's end the death penalty.
Thank you, Leno. Before we go to questions from the audience and from the folks who are watching on the live stream. I want to take this opportunity to thank the European Union and Ambassador O'Sullivan for hosting this event and for giving a platform for these fine panelists to give you their views on what's going on with the death penalty and what the future looks like. I also have to do the obligatory Death Penalty Information Center disclaimer, which is that we are a national nonprofit organization that provides information and analysis on death penalty issues. Often the information seems to have a particular point of view because there are particular things about the death penalty that show that the system is badly broken. But the Death Penalty Information Center itself is a nonpartisan organization. We don't take a formal position for or against the death penalty. We are critical of the manner in which it has been administered both here and in other places around the world. I do want to tell you, suggest one additional thing, the way people think about innocence. Because, you know, we have documented 159 people have been exonerated from death row in the United States. That is a severe understatement of what the problem actually is. We know there are individuals who are innocent who have been executed. We also know that there are dozens at least, and we have a formal list of the people who've been legally exonerated. We don't yet have a list of these other folks, but there are dozens at least of individuals who were wrongly convicted, wrongly condemned, won new trials, and then were faced with a situation of having to plead guilty or plead no contest to offenses that they did not commit, to avoid having to face additional capital charges. People who've spent 20, 25 years in solitary confinement on death row who simply wanted to see their families now. And there are dozens and dozens of these other innocent people who have not gotten their due. And people do not understand that the risk of convicting the innocent is shown not just by the people who have been exonerated, but by the people who should have been exonerated and were not. And the dangers of the death penalty goes far beyond just convicting the people who are innocent. We see the misuse of capital prosecutions. Beyond the people who are convicted and sentenced to death. We see the misuse of the death penalty by threatening witnesses with facing capital prosecution if they don't testify against individuals. And there are dozens and dozens of people, and we're working with the National Registry of Exonerations to identify many of them, who were wrongly convicted after having faced capital charges they never should have faced, and others who were wrongly convicted of a range of charges because witnesses were forced to choose between facing capital charges themselves or testifying falsely. So the problem of exoneration, the problem of innocence, is one that is much graver than we even acknowledge today. And this is a problem that we see not just in the United States. We see this around the world. And around the world, we see the same kind of thing, that there are a favored class of victims. And when you have a favored class of victims, you're more likely to have the death penalty pursued in those cases. And irrespective of the class of victims, once you're looking at who the victim is, in the United States, if you are a white victim, what kind of defendant is most likely to go to death row? You are disproportionately likely to be sentenced to death if there's a white victim, if you are a defendant of color. Well, guess what? If you have a black victim, you are disproportionately likely to be sentenced to death as a defendant if you're a person of color too. There are two levels of discrimination. The discrimination doesn't go away. There is a preference for a favored class of victim, whatever country it is. There is a discrimination against a disfavored group of defendants, whatever the country it is. You could be Shia, you could be black, you could be gay, whatever. These things highlight the risks that never go away in every country and every state and every county that has capital punishment. So again, I'd like to thank the EU and Ambassador O'Sullivan for having us tonight. And now we're going to open it up for questions from the audience.
Thank you. Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. I had just come from another human rights thing down the road, and this was most enlightening. I've worked for many years in human rights issues all over the world, Muslim countries, countries that were somewhat more agnostic, like, former Soviet republics, etc., etc. And what I have found is that one of the main groups that we have to address, no matter what, are families and loved ones of the victims. Because if they don't play a part, you end up, disproportionately blaming somebody who may or may not be guilty. So I always say, please, could we help in trying to enlighten those who are close to the victims so that their grievances, their frustrations, and their sense of injustice can be somewhat, if not totally taken away, at least somewhat minimized. You might not get them all on board, but you will get a few on board. The second thing is that, especially in a place like the United States, can we not insist upon mandated DNA testing everywhere so that it's not up to a governor, not up to a mayor, or not up to somebody in power, that at least DNA testing is always done in case somebody was convicted years ago or in case someone's about to be convicted. Thank you.
Let me do a quick answer on the DNA. One of the things we've learned from the exonerations is that DNA is present in only a tiny fraction of the cases. Of the 159 exonerees, 20 involved DNA evidence. The rest of them, DNA evidence was not present. But what the DNA has taught us is the reliability, or should I say, the lack of reliability of the rest of the evidence. Because when you have the DNA that shows that somebody didn't do it, it tells you not just they didn't do it, but that every other piece of evidence that came in suggesting that the defendant was guilty was wrong. And I think that's been one of the things that has created very, very serious questions about the sustainability of capital punishment if that kind of evidence that is relied on routinely, eyewitness testimony, expert testimony, jailhouse informants, and so forth, if it's been proven to be so unreliable in cases where we have conclusive DNA evidence, what makes us think it's any more reliable in the other cases? On the question of victims' families, Leno, do you want to talk about that?
I think also Henderson can say a few words, even though I don't want to give him the microphone. But we have found since '85, when I started working on the death penalty in the South, that we needed to reach out, and even my friend Sister Helen Prejean, that we made a mistake early on in our movement in not talking to murder victims' families, because we really needed them as a voice. And there have been a number of groups that have come out and worked with us to abolish the death penalty, and I work closely with Bobby Kennedy's daughter, who runs the Kennedy Foundation, the JFK, Carrie Kennedy, on abolition. I worked with Coretta Scott King when she was alive and her children on getting rid of the death penalty, who were murder victims' families. But I think it is impossible for us to judge the pain that happens to the family of a murder victim. And we have to know that DAs mistreat them as well. I asked the top DA who was for the death penalty, because he was saying that they needed to execute the person to bring closure. And I asked him, Josh Marquise in his home district, I asked him in front of 200 of his local voters, I said, when was the last time, since you want to talk about murder victims' families' pain, that when you were seeking the death penalty, that you went and sat with the family and felt their pain and the difficulty they were having? And he said, never. And I said, how dare you say that you speak for the murder victims' families? We should never diminish their pain. We should keep communications open. And there's a lot of groups that are working for abolition with us on the 14th of October, starting out of Houston. I will be there for the beginning of the Journey of Hope, which is, they'll go throughout Texas for about 20 days talking about abolition of the death penalty. It's made up primarily of murder victims' family members and about 3 of our exonerees that will be on this journey. But Henderson has also worked a lot in this issue, so I'd ask my brother for a few comments.
Thank you. I think it's a great question. As a trial lawyer for 35 years, I've spent a lot of time with murder victim family members. It's rare that a mother who's lost a child wants to see another mother deprived of a child. There are some universalities, and that pain does not, inflicting pain does not relieve pain. We saw 2 years ago in Charleston on June 17th when a young man went into a church and killed 9 people. You saw the response of those family members to that. Yeah, I had the great privilege of meeting with many of those family members. None of them thought that they were going to have their pain, their loss relieved by the taking of this young man's life. You know, one of the horrible things about the death penalty is it puts public authorities, public officials, in the position of selling a bill of goods that's false to family members. That taking this other family's child, son, father, uncle away will in somehow raise the legacy, cherish the memory of your lost one. And time after time after time, family members reject that. And that's why murder victim families for reconciliation have been very effective in sort of being a bridge of communication with family members who have lost loved ones to violence, to just give voice to what they think they need to get stronger, healthier, and participate in civil life. And almost without fail, it's not inflicting that pain on others. You know, there are different ways that family grieves. And, you know, just as a person that's been in touch with lots of families, I can't speak in universal terms. There are some families in their place where anger and rage and vengeance and retribution dominates. But for public officials to sort of feed that, you know, that's an ugliness that no civilized society should tolerate, because there's a potential in that space to be healing, to provide health, to provide a way to, you know, get out of this darkness and not to sort of feed it. And when public officials use their position to encourage people to act out of anger and retribution, it only makes the family, the community less healthy.
I think that's all right, but I wanted to speak to a little bit more of your second point about the DNA testing issue, and I agree with Rob that it's such a rare issue, but I chose to use my time to talk about the severe mental illness exemption, but there are reforms still needed in states because it is incredibly inconsistent about post-conviction DNA testing access across the country. And I promise you, I don't usually sound like Marilyn Monroe, but I have an assistant who's taking my breath space, so I'm a little breathier than usual. But so that's a space where reform is still needed, and I think those can coexist in states where abolition's being pursued and where it's not, because there's this drumbeat of finality. When you're talking about anything in post-conviction, you hear a drumbeat largely from the prosecutorial community, but sometimes from the legislators themselves who say we need finality, or it's too expensive, it's prohibitively expensive. And so there is still a very uneven landscape about what access to post-conviction testing is. I'll actually compliment my home state of Texas. They've actually been a trailblazer in some of their access to testing, but that's a space that's still needed. Parallel to that would be there's energy still for reform about police practices, videotaping the entirety of confessions if you're going to use them for prosecution of crimes from start to finish, no gaps. How you do eyewitness identification procedures, lineups, and things. So there's quality of evidence and caliber of evidence issues that I think we can still use to highlight. And when the answer is, well, aren't those too expensive? Or a couple of others that come to mind that are of interest in reform are use of jailhouse snitches or cooperating informants. What's the quality of the evidence that we're using to secure these convictions? And when can we look back? What's our reform to post-conviction processes in general? Habeas corpus is a whole other day that we could talk about, troubling restrictions on access to review of these cases. And so there's a lot of these other spaces to be talking about discrete reforms that could really make a difference in our justice system, both for the death penalty, but for non-capital cases as well. I mean, you can sort of see the death penalty as an iceberg issue, but one where lives are very much at stake, so we should treat it as seriously as it is. But if we start having those conversations, we can really shape the whole justice system and talk about, if you can't sustain the cost of doing this correctly, then what are we doing? Or do it and your citizens will have more confidence in the system and the convictions which we secure. So I think it's a great point, and there are a lot of pieces like that that should be addressed.
I want to make one last comment before we go on to the next question. On the question of victims' families, I think it's, in many respects, a bellwether for how much things have changed in the United States. In 1995, when Pennsylvania carried out its first execution in more than 30 years, the person executed was Keith Zettelmoyer. I represented the victim's mother, who did not want Keith Zettelmoyer to be executed. At the time of his execution, she was quoted in the press as saying that, "I don't want people to think that I am strange. I don't want people to think that I'm disloyal because I don't want Keith Zettelmoyer to be executed." I think that we're in a much safer space now for family members of murder victims, because they no longer feel as though they are being disloyal when they speak out and say, "We don't want the death penalty in this case," whether it's for moral reasons or whether it's because what we've seen over and over with increasing frequency these days, because they don't want their children to be subjected to the extended appellate process that's necessary to try to ensure that somebody is not unconstitutionally executed. They don't want the wound reopened, ripped open every time you go into court proceedings, and they don't want the worst day of their life to be something that they subject themselves and their loved ones to. So I think that the question of how victims' family members are reacting to the death penalty really is a kind of canary that tells us what the status of the death penalty has become.
Hi. I've been tangentially involved in this movement for a while, but most recently in the last year and a half, and observing it quite a bit too. So I think there's the death penalty to me is symbolic of a much broader problem, that the justice system is broken. And the justice system in this country, at least, is broken. And everybody's shaking their head, yes, about something.
I'm sorry. The congressman has arrived, so why don't we?
Okay.
Let's hold the question.
Wait, tell him to wait a minute, would you? Sorry.
I'm afraid he's been waiting a long time with some votes tonight.
I know.
Yeah.
And ma'am, if anybody has a problem with that, then tell them to go talk to my friend President Trump.
I think we can see eye to eye.
Okay. All right. Good afternoon. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Hank Johnson. I represent Georgia's 4th Congressional District, and it pleases me to be here with you tonight. I want to welcome my brothers and sisters from across the pond. Welcome to America. And gosh, I guess the North American continent, to a certain extent, as well as the continent of Europe, have been undergoing some seismic changes here of late. A lot of it, all of it, has to do with the people themselves. The people themselves have manifested our current reality. And so if we understand that the people have created this current environment, then we can relax in the knowledge that it's the people that will bring a little bit more stability after the storm. So I want everybody to breathe a sigh of relief as you ponder issues of universal importance, security, national security, international security. You know, as you weigh those kinds of issues, and as we address this micro issue of the death penalty, and what does it say about us as a human race, as the most developed form of life, certainly on this planet, not to mention maybe there may be some life forms on some other planets that we don't know about. Perhaps they know about us and they are looking down and with great amusement checking us out, wondering how we function. But I can tell you, ladies and gentlemen, one thing that is important is the abolition of the death penalty. I believe that the essence of humanity lies in a human being's appreciation of the fact that human life is not to be taken arbitrarily and capriciously, and that respect for the dignity of human life requires that men should find a more humane way, a more enlightened means to punish those who take the life of others. As many of you may know, I'm a lawyer by training, and prior to my service to the Congress of the United States and Georgia's 4th Congressional District, I spent 27 years I spent as a practicing attorney, and I also served as a magistrate court judge. And after my time in the courtroom, I've been honored and privileged to continue my service in the public domain as a member of Congress, where I've served for the last 11 years. And over the course of my career, ladies and gentlemen, I've come to a lot of conclusions about a diverse array of societal issues. One of them is about the death penalty. In my humble opinion, in addition to being morally reprehensible, the death penalty also is unconstitutional in that it violates the 8th Amendment of the United States Constitution, which forbids the imposition of cruel and unusual punishment. In my view, the death penalty is morally reprehensible, as I say, and in my editing, I see where I have been repetitious here. I've already said that. Imposition of the death penalty does not get any more crueler and unusualer than the botched execution of Clayton Lockett by the state of Oklahoma back on April 29th of 2014. At 5:06 a.m. that morning, prison guards came to Clayton Lockett's cell. But before they got there, and knowing that he was about to be executed, Mr. Lockett tried to kill himself with a safety razor, slicing his wrist, and also by swallowing a handful of pills that he had been hoarding. He was unsuccessful in his attempts to take his own life, and so when the guards entered his cell, he pulled the covers up over his head, and he refused to get up. So the guards left the cell and went to get permission from the warden to taser him, to make him comply. And when the order was given to apply the taser, it came back, opened up the door, tased him into submission, and he was led to the death row area where he was bathed and shaved and, you know, some of the other formalities that they go through in the preparation of the application of the death penalty. And finally, he was taken to the gurney and strapped down, and an IV was inserted into his arm, and a 3-drug cocktail was to be administered, with the first drug rendering him unconscious, the second causing paralysis, and the third stopping the heart. A very clinical, sterile procedure of applying the death penalty. Quick, painless, and boom, that's it. But it didn't work out like that. The execution was painfully protracted, and it did not result in a swift death. In fact, it was a torturous death, with the witnesses who had come to observe, for whatever reason, the imposition of the death penalty. It must have left them feeling horrendous, or perhaps maybe the subhuman parts of the human consciousness took over, and people really felt like, well, he deserved it, and I'm enjoying this vindication in watching this man suffer because he applied such suffering to his victims, and so therefore I'm so humane. I want to see an eye for an eye. I want to see him suffer to the last moment. I mean, is that humanity? If death by lethal injection, even if it happens to take place normally or without any hitches, is lethal injection, is that whole process not cruel? Is it not unusual? If it's not, I don't know what is. With recent restrictions on the death penalty for the mentally retarded and those who were minors when they committed their capital crimes, the Supreme Court of the United States is beginning to meaningfully curb the imposition of the penalty. In 2002, in Atkins versus Virginia, the Supreme Court held that it is unconstitutional to execute defendants with mental retardation. 3 years later, in Roper versus Simmons, it held as unconstitutional the imposition of the death penalty for individuals who were juveniles at the time of the commission of the crime. However, this is not enough. We also know that the death penalty is disproportionately brought in cases involving African Americans, and because of an inability to acquire effective assistance of counsel or a myriad of other reasons, African Americans, along with other minorities and poor communities, have this ultimate penalty imposed against them at disproportionately higher rates as compared to others. DNA exonerations have proven that innocent people have been sentenced to die, and when the ultimate penalty is carried out, mistakes have been made. The only way to prevent the erroneous application of the ultimate penalty of death is for there to be an outright ban on imposition of the death penalty. A ban is the only way to prevent ultimate injustice. Throughout my professional career, I have been exposed to the death penalty in many different contexts. As a former criminal defense lawyer, one can't help but identify common threads among those who have been given the ultimate punishment. One of my proudest moments was a case right out of law school that I took. It was a habeas corpus petition in state court for a death row inmate who was scheduled to die about 60 days thereafter. And I took the case, State of Georgia versus Howard Jones. I'm pleased to say that after about 4 years of legal wrangling, I was able to get that death penalty case reversed on grounds of ineffective assistance of counsel, and also, more notably, prosecutorial misconduct, the knowing use of perjured testimony by the prosecutor in that case. Crimes that people are charged with and convicted of are often heinous, and I purport to make no excuses for the conduct of those who would unlawfully take life, but is condemning someone to death the right answer? Are some murderers inherently more violent than other individuals, such that non-capital sentences are unworkable for some and workable for others? How large a role do socioeconomic factors play? Now, if you stop and take a look at how and upon whom the death penalty is administered, you will see a most troubling trend. Oftentimes, those condemned to death never had a chance in life. I doubt I will find supporters of the death penalty in this room, but in the off chance that there are a few folks, I encourage you all to look at the files of those that have been sent to death, and you will find that many of them come from broken homes. They observed violence as a means to solve problems from an early age. They had a revolving door of adults who purported to be parental figures, but in actuality were predators placed in a position to abuse those whom they were entrusted to protect. On average, future death row inmates often experience with drugs at an early age. They suffer from mental illness and are themselves victims of abuse. The problem is not just with those individuals who find themselves in the crosshairs of the criminal justice system. It's also how the death penalty is administered. In his dissenting opinion in Glossip versus Gloss, Justice Stephen Breyer wrote that the death penalty lacks the requisite reliability, and that without this reliability, the death penalty is in fact cruel and unusual punishment. Additionally, researchers have found that in the past 3 decades, innocent people have been executed, and that there have been a number of instances where the death penalty was wrongfully imposed. The Supreme Court has said that there have been 115 instances where death row inmates were later exonerated. In 2014 alone, 6 death row inmates were exonerated. All 6 had been in prison for more than 30 years, and 1 had been in prison for almost 40 years. A few years ago, I had an opportunity to meet Troy Anthony Davis, a death row inmate in Georgia. I visited with him on several occasions, found him to be a very humane individual. For those of you who don't know, Troy Davis was a Georgia man who was convicted of murdering a police officer in Savannah, Georgia. His case was well publicized, and he was given many separate execution dates, one in July 2007, one in September 2008, and in October 2008. All 3 were postponed, and Mr. Davis, however, was eventually executed in 2011. He at all times denied shooting the police officer, and his case went through a circuitous path through the Georgia and federal courts on 3 different occasions, including how to handle the matter of a key prosecution witness who had recanted his testimony. One of his appeals went all the way to the Supreme Court with an instruction from that court to the federal trial court to receive testimony and make findings of fact as to whether evidence could not have been obtained at the time of trial that would establish Davis's innocence. And in accordance with this directive, the federal trial court denied him the opportunity to have that newly discovered evidence considered, and as a result, he was ultimately executed. This is a very distressing story that procedural hurdles would trump justice, the search for justice. 7 of the 9 eyewitnesses involved in Davis's trial had recanted their testimony, and one of the 2 eyewitnesses who did not recant would have been the prime suspect in the case if he had. I regret to say that my state of Georgia has a troubled history when it comes to imposition of the death penalty. Georgia is a top 10 state insofar as the number of its prisoners on death row. Since 1976, when the death penalty in America was restored, the state of Georgia has executed 69 men and 1 woman, with 15 of these executions taking place within just the past 3 years. There are currently 62 people on Georgia's death row. The American Bar Association has found jarring and systematic problems with the implementation of the death penalty in Georgia. The ABA has cited Georgia for underfunding its Capital Defender Office and has taken exception with the state's failure to provide defense counsel in state and federal habeas corpus proceedings. Of the 26 states that have adopted statutes prohibiting the execution of the mentally retarded, Georgia is the only one that requires the capital defendant to prove his or her mental retardation beyond a reasonable doubt. Other states have lower, more humane threshold showings. And judges presiding over the capital cases also bear some blame for Georgia's inadequacies. A recent survey of Georgia capital jurors found that 41% did not understand that they could consider any evidence in mitigation of the death penalty, and 62% of them believed that the defense had to prove the existence of mitigating factors beyond a reasonable doubt. Race and racism, this country's chronic problem, is a factor in Georgia also. A recent study found that those suspected of killing whites are 4.5 times more likely to be sentenced to death as opposed to those who are suspected of killing blacks. In fact, the national statistics on this are troubling. On a national level, over 75% of murder victims in cases resulting in an execution were white, even though nationally only 50% of murder victims generally are white. In 48 of 50 states, a full 96% of states where there have been reviews of race and death penalty, of race and the death penalty, there was a pattern of either race of victim or race of defendant discrimination. All told, a recent Supreme Court survey found that a full 4% of those sentenced to death are actually innocent. There is another reason often touted for maintaining the ultimate punishment, and that is some folks like to think that the death penalty is actually a deterrent to committing crimes. Yet a report by the National Research Council stated that studies claiming that the death penalty has a deterrent effect on murder rates are fundamentally flawed and should not be used when making policy decisions. In a recent survey of former and present presidents of the country's top academic criminological societies, 88% of these experts reject the notion that the death penalty acts as a deterrent to murder. The death penalty is arbitrary. It's unlikely to be uniformly implemented. For example, according to the FBI Uniform Crime Report, the southern United States, which has the highest murder rate, accounted for 80% of all executions. The Northeast, by contrast, had the lowest murder rate and accounted for less than 1% of all executions. On a more granular level, between 2004 and 2009, just 29 counties, fewer than 1% of the country's counties, accounted for approximately half of all death sentences imposed nationwide. And in 2012, just 59 counties accounted for all death sentences imposed nationwide. Why is this? Are some counties better at handing out death sentences, or are other counties better at defending criminals? We don't know, but we do know that these issues merit close and careful consideration as societal standards of human decency evolve and a march towards abolition seems to be underway. The discrepancies are concerning and should be of counsel, or should counsel the Supreme Court to one day soon find that the death penalty is cruel and unusual punishment and that it violates the 8th Amendment of the United States Constitution. My friends, imposition of the death penalty in America is very troubling. My conclusion, which I share with others, is that the death penalty is a moral abomination. The time has come to abolish it, and I want to thank you for having me here tonight to share my opinions with you, and I hope that what I've said is of some value to you. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Congressman, we'd like to thank you so much for joining us this evening. A great pleasure, and your constant support for this very, very important issue is really a great source of strength, and thank you for such a wonderful speech. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you all.
So I would just like to thank everyone involved in this evening, in particular our panelists. You know, we as the European Union say we have a very strong position on this issue, and we do. But it's not a position of any moral superiority. We grappled with these issues in our own time. We maybe were lucky to succeed in abolishing it a little bit earlier. But I'm always deeply humbled when I listen to the Americans who are in the front line of this, and each of you in your own way is leading that battle. I'm always humbled at the conviction, the determination, the generosity of spirit which inspires you. I think particularly of the Exonerees, it is a constant source of amazement how people can have endured that kind of injustice and come out still with a positive attitude and wanting to make things better and with no sense of bitterness. So it really is very, very humbling to listen to the quality of the debate this evening, and I'm very confident that this great country will find its own way towards the abolition of the death penalty in due course, and if we can contribute to that, we would very much wish to do so. I'd like to acknowledge the presence of two of my ambassador colleagues, our new Croatian ambassador who's been here all evening, and our Dutch colleague was here earlier but had to leave, so I'd like to thank them also. This is something we do in close cooperation with our member states, and they work very closely with us, so it's very valuable. And I'd also like to thank the Mongolian Chargé d'Affaires for being here, and the good example that Mongolia has shown not only in abolishing the death penalty, but in taking initiative in the UN for an alliance against trade in torture and instruments of the death penalty. On that note, I would invite you now, please, to join us for a glass of wine and a reception, and a little moment of social conviviality. Thank you very much indeed.